What will be the effect of a federal government totally controlled by the Democratic Party? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of The Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. I am Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of The Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the consistent, principled perspective on what's going on in the world from a libertarian standpoint. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, Professor of Economics at the Citadel. Richard, Happy New Year to you, and good to see you again.
Happy New Year to you, to our viewers and listeners, in the beginning of a new year, a new decade, the third decade of the 21st century, and on top of that, and soon to be inaugurated new presidential administration.
Yeah, lots of interesting things happening. And thank you all for tuning in, and thank you for your great support of our work, your end of year support. And I hope we can count on you to help us out as the year progresses, because we've got some big battles that are now going to take place. You know, for 30 years, every year, stretching back to about 1990, we've said, oh, things can't get much worse. And Richard was with me when we started the Future of Freedom Foundation back then, and every year things did get worse. And I think now, Richard, there's just no doubt that things are going to get worse again. That now, amidst all this chaos and crisis and things, we've got a full Democratic Party control of the federal government. With them having gained those 2 Senate seats in Georgia, they now control everything. There's always these laments from statists, oh, deadlock, gridlock in the government, and oh, this is terrible, and we can't get anything done. Well, I've always believed that gridlock's a good thing because it prevents these people, both Republicans and Democrats, from doing too many bad things to us. And that one-party rule is a very, very destructive thing from the standpoint of us libertarians. And we're about to see that. I think that we're living in some times that are possibly more dangerous than we've ever lived in the last 30 years. These people, the Democrats, are going to stop at nothing now to achieve their agenda. And what is that agenda? You're talking about massive federal spending. Look how Biden got the votes in those Georgia Senate races. He immediately went over there and said, I promise you that if you elect me, I'll get you $2,000 a month instead of $600 a month. I don't see how that's legal, that when you're simply bribing voters that way. He's essentially offering them government money in return for votes, but it was very successful. People will choose $2,000 over $600 any day of the week. And now, as a result of that, you're going to see massive federal spending programs, not just with this additional stimulus with the extra $1,400. You're going to see massive federal spending. It's going to be going through the roof. The debt ceiling has always been somewhat irrelevant, the way they keep lifting it, but it's going to be a total irrelevancy now. And you've got massive foreign interventionism. Biden is going to be essentially owned by the national security establishment. That was the way it was under the Obama administration when he was vice president. You're going to see these official enemies rising to the surface even more than you already have: Russia, China, terrorism. You're going to see expansion of the military's role in American life and international life. You're going to see expansions of the welfare state. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to push through a full-fledged government-provided healthcare system. And you've got drug war. Biden, he's talking a little bit softly on the drug war, but don't forget, he was one of the biggest proponents of the drug war when he was vice president. And you put Kamala Harris involved in that, where she was one of the proponents, or as a prosecutor, of putting people away for this war. I think you're going to ultimately see an expansion of that, if for no other reason that the DEA is going to demand it. They got jobs and so forth. The drug war business is a big business. You've got regulations that are going to go out the gazoo. I mean, we're already such a highly regulated society. I don't think we've seen anything yet. So, with this full government takeover, you're going to see massive welfare state socialism, even more than we already have. You're going to see a massive centrally planned economy, massive debauchery of the currency. Uh, Things are going to be very precarious in the coming year, which I think makes our work even more important than ever. What do you think, Richard?
Well, first, I have to start off by clarifying something that you said at the beginning, and that is we began FFF 30 years ago thinking that things could not get worse, and these 30 years have gone by and things have gotten worse. I want to assure our viewers and listeners that this is a correlation. Okay, this is the Future Freedom Foundation has not created us moving further down the road of socialism.
Good point. Good
Please,
point.
please. Correlation, not causation. Hey, I'm trying to save your butt here.
That's an excellent point. Excellent.
Oh, but listen, things often seem so serious. You have to take a little levity in these things. But I think that the danger that you're articulating, looking certainly for the next 2 to 4, or even whoever is president on the Democratic side for 8 years, is one that should be viewed as very threatening. It is clear that the Biden administration is going to attempt to act as if the last 4 years did not occur, by which I mean to pick up where the Obama administration had left off. They had done Obamacare, but not fully socialized, nationalized healthcare and medicine. I think you're right. They're going to make a big push for that. They were unable to push for tax increases. They will push for that. They will attempt to extend a new definition of heavy-handed government regulation, including antitrust enforcement, of hamstringing the private sector and accusing corporations and businesses of doing things for which, from a sound economic point of view, has no basis in fact, either in theory or circumstance. I think that you're going to see a big push for a Green New Deal. Now, whether they call it that, as was being pushed under that label about a year or two ago by some of the more radical lefties in Congress, there'll be a push for a Green New Deal. There's going to be a push for identity politics, in the sense that there's going to be a demand for not just for equality of opportunity, but equality of outcomes. And outcomes are going to be defined as quantitative quotas for different ethnic and gender groups. That a society is unfair, unjust, and tyrannical unless every classified group, by those on the left who do the classification, you're black, you're privileged white, you're Hispanic, you're male, you're female, you're all the 32 types of genders in between, unless you have your proportional representation in every profession, occupation, line of work, and income. And that income effect is also going to be clearly a push for a national increase in the minimum wage to $15 or higher, which is going to be decimating for many businesses around the country after having been destroyed by the lockdowns and shutdowns, which were the government's response to the coronavirus. And finally, I think you're absolutely right to emphasize that the lid is released from even the nominal illusion of a debt ceiling. We now have a national debt of over $27.5 trillion. Okay? Just that 7.5 trillion of it has been just since Trump came into office 4 years ago. It's been increasing exponentially through the 21st century. And that is going to become worse now. And the additional thing is that how is it going to be covered? Well, the government obviously issues its bonds, its securities, and people in the corporate or private or international sector buy them up. But what will happen is that, has been going on, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, will end up buying up a lot of those government securities in huge amounts. And how will they pay for their purchase? by creating new money. So I think that while inflation has been very low for a long time now, we cannot ignore the possibility that with this huge growth of government spending and the funding of deficits, that we may see the ugly head of significant price inflation once again. And if there's any, if there's anything that you can say about, the repetition based upon premises applied, if inflation were to become, quote, bad in a relatively short period of time, don't be surprised if we see a rerun of the the late 1960s and early 1970s and into the 1970s, when what did the federal government do? Impose wage and price control, right? That was done, 1972 by Richard Nixon, a Republican. So everything is on the table that could be a danger to our liberty, to our privacy, to the honestly acquired income and wealth and property that we own, and to the freedom that remains of any competitive opportunities in a marketplace. So we need to redouble our efforts here in defense of liberty, pragmatically in the sense of responding to their arguments when it's economic fallacies or political misinformations, but more fundamentally is to challenge them on the very premises upon which they're going to make this cases. A collectivist argument, a group, the society, the common good, and that their presumption to have the knowledge, wisdom, and ability to do this right, and to recur back to our founding principles of the founding fathers, those evil people of the past, in founding this country on a revolutionary idea that society begins with individuals, and that individuals who have rights, and those rights give them wide latitude of personal liberty with their lives and that which they have honestly earned to freely interact with their neighbors for mutual benefit. And the law is there to secure those freedoms and not to violate them, and certainly not to abridge and take them away. We have to be focusing upon that as the steamroller attempts to crush whatever freedom remains in America.
Yeah, I think if you look at the real threats to our well-being and to our liberty, they come in two broad areas, maybe three. One is the welfare state way of life, and the crown jewels of the welfare state way of life are Social Security and Medicare. Two, socialist programs that no Democrat wants to touch, certainly not repeal. No Republican wants to do that, and unfortunately, many libertarians do not call for the repeal of these socialist programs. They want them to be reformed. But then you add on top of the crown jewels the whole panoply of welfare state programs: farm subsidies, education grants, food stamps, foreign aid is a welfare program. I mean, you're talking about massive government spending, federal spending, that far exceeds the tax revenues. Now, this pandemic has only made things significantly worse in terms of tax revenues, because the government spending hasn't decreased. Everybody's tightening his belt, or a lot of people are tightening their belts during this pandemic, fearing loss of jobs, loss of income. The government hasn't tightened its belt. It has actually expanded spending, even though its tax revenues are arguably going down because so many people have been put out of work by the lockdowns. Then you've got the warfare state, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, to a certain extent the FBI. Do you see them tightening their belts? I mean, all you see is the military saying, we need our money. We need it. If you're going to cut, you cut somewhere else, but you're not cutting with us. And the whole military industrial complex, the contractors, subcontractors, all those foreign military bases, I don't know, total about 1,000 foreign military bases. I mean, those bases like in Germany that are like country clubs, where they're almost like little American cities, and that exist all over the world, with their golf courses and their PXs, and I mean their McDonald's. I mean, these are like little American cities that are all funded through American taxes. The Pentagon and the CIA, they're not interested in cutting their expenditures. So you've got this massive demand on the system, and now you've got on top of that, well, then the third aspect is the regulated society, the centrally planned society, the drug war, the regulations, the border controls. I mean, all these kind of regulations that that costs money. You're talking about a massive demand on the system. And then on top of that now is with all this stimulus money that is, I mean, they're obviously pulling out all the stops there to increase the so-called stimulus money. I mean, this thing cannot end well. I mean, I think the chickens may finally be coming home to roost. We've been arguing against the system for 30 years about why the system is a bad system. It's an immoral system, and that the much better system is the one based on the economic principles on which this country was founded. Economic liberty, not for everyone. We know that slavery was a big exception, but in terms of the broad body of American people, I mean, there was this concept of economic liberty where there was no income tax, where there was no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, farm subsidies, education grants, foreign aid, Pentagon, CIA, NSA, drug war, immigration controls. I mean, on and on and on. That was the founding system of this country, and they abandoned that. And for 30 years, we've been saying that abandonment's a bad thing. It needs to be changed. And you're right. We have gotten nowhere. We haven't caused the problem, but we've attracted adherents. I mean, we've got supporters that have studied it. They analyze it. They've concluded you guys are right that economic liberty, the founding principles of economic liberty, are the way to go. Well, we've argued it always on a moral basis that people have a right to be free, to manage their own lives, to manage their own retirement, to manage their own charitable decisions, that this whole welfare state way of life is immoral. It's wrong to force people to be good and caring. I mean, those are opposites. Force and good and caring are opposites. But we also argue the utilitarian case, Richard. This is not going to end well. You're going to have massive debauchery of the currency, and we've already seen it over the decades. If you look at the value of the dollar since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, it's just downward. Now, it may not be a direct downward plunge. It may have been more like this, but over the years, they drove out of circulation all the silver dollars, the silver dimes, the silver quarters, just monetary debauchery. And we've warned against this time after time, year after year. But I think that we might be reaching a point where the chickens are really going to come home to roost, where we're looking at some real economic crises, especially now the Democrats have taken full control over the government. I mean, they honestly believe, Richard, or at least they profess to honestly believe, that ours is a capitalist system. They look at this welfare state way of life. They look at this regulated economy. They look at this centrally planned system. They look at this national security state way of life. And in their minds, this is capitalism. And you see in their op-eds that capitalism's not working. Look how many rich people there are, and look how many poor people there are. We need something else. And of course, what else is an expansion of their welfare state, centrally planned socialist way of life. And that's what we're going to see this as things get worse. And I think things are going to get worse economically, financially. And their argument's going to be, well, see, capitalism has failed. We need now, 100% government provided health care. We need more massive government controls over the borders and so forth. I mean, let's not forget that Obama was known as the deporter in chief. And this was before Trump took over. And maybe Trump set the record after Obama, but this was all with the complicity of Joe Biden. He may not continue that ridiculous Berlin Wall that Trump started, but I guarantee you he is going to be fully on board on creating more massive destruction and destruction of liberty with his war on immigrants. So we're looking at some very tyrannical times, not just with the pandemic, the lockdowns, the mask mandates, and so forth. We're looking at, I think, possibly a perfect storm here, a perfect storm of an economic crisis, a perfect storm of a monetary crisis, and with the interventionist warfare state where they're making Russia and China now, new Cold War type enemies of the United States, along with all their terrorism and all their provocations of Iran and their activities in Yemen and Africa, we may be looking at a warfare state crisis as well. And you put all these together into a massive crisis, you're looking at some really harsh, tyrannical measures here, all democratically done, but done by one-party control of the federal government.
Yeah, I want to pick up on one of the things that you brought out, and that is the foreign policy aspect. Donald Trump tried to portray himself as someone who wanted to pull back and be non-interventionist in foreign policy. The internationalist foreign policy establishment in Washington and other places tried to, accuse him of being the isolationist. Now, he wasn't, in fact. But if one followed the literature like Foreign Affairs Magazine, The Quarterly, and others that sort of focus on foreign policy from the traditional establishment perspective of Washington, D.C., they have been livid on his arguments that America shouldn't be involved, America shouldn't be everywhere, Europeans should be more responsible for their own defense, et cetera, et cetera. They're salivating with anticipation of a return to what they view as their leading role and direction of an interventionist foreign policy, reinforcing NATO, America involved more actively in aspects of Asia confronting China, the U.S. taking a more involved role in South America and so on. So we are likely to see, to the best that the Biden administration can overcome how Europeans have perceived the U.S. over the last 4 years, an attempt to reignite and re-solidify and reestablish that activist outreach that is just another part of the interventionist welfare state. Not just trying to reform and make over America in America, but to try to reform the world in an elitist conception of how the world should look through American Washington, D.C. eyes.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, many years ago, I was at a Ed Crane, the president of Cato Institute's annual Salmon Fest conference. This is probably like 20 years ago. And somebody came up to me and said, what do you consider the greatest danger, threat to American liberty and well-being? And I didn't hesitate. I said, the warfare state, the national security state. There's just no question about it. And one of my favorite books is a book called National Security and Double Government by a guy named Michael J. Glennon. Now, Glennon is not your standard, crackpot theorist, they're just writing a silly book. This guy is a professor of law at Tufts University and actually served as counsel to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, I think it was, at least some Senate committee. And so this guy's a genuine scholar, and his thesis is quite ominous. He says, look, let's face it, the national security state is really what's in charge in America. The Pentagon, the NSA, and the CIA. Now, they permit the other three branches to have the veneer of power, like the judiciary is still in charge, of Congress and the president. But he says, it's just a veneer. He says, and they don't care about the appearance. What matters is the real power, that they are the ones that really run in the show. And you can see that in terms of the Supreme Court deferring to whatever they do. All they have to do is mention national security, and the Supreme Court will uphold the power of assassination, never get involved in foreign interventionism, never get involved declaring foreign wars unconstitutional because they don't have a declaration of war. And the president himself goes along with this. I mean, the last president that really mentioned this potential danger was Eisenhower in his farewell address, and that's a shocking farewell address where he's talking about this apparatus, which he pointed out was new to the American life, and he said, which was necessary because of the Cold War, is a very real threat to our liberties and democratic processes. And then he was followed by John Kennedy, who had he read the movie 7 Days in May, and had it made into a movie to serve as a warning to the American people of the dangers of this type of system. No president since then has issued that kind of warning. They've all just deferred to the power of the Pentagon, the NSA, and the CIA. Now, Trump was a little bit different. He came in talking different. He talked about the Iraq War being based on false premises and lies. He talked about the CIA and all its foibles and interventions and so forth. He questioned the Pentagon as part of his campaign. But as soon as he got into office, he folded. He surrounded himself with generals. He started provoking conflicts with Iran, with North Korea, with others. Now, to his credit, he didn't start any new wars, but he certainly tried to, especially with Iran. But for some reason, he folded. But they didn't like the way he talked. They didn't like his attitude. He didn't show that respectful, deferential, get on your knees and kiss the ring attitude toward the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. And he had to go. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the powers that be in the deep state were deeply committed to getting rid of Donald Trump, because what they want is that standard kind of president that defers to their authority, lets them continue having that free hand to manage the world, to control the world, to do what they think is necessary. And you see this especially now with their ramping up. Russia is the new official enemy, revamping the old Cold War mindset. China now is the new official enemy, that they're becoming too pushy, too aggressive, too assertive. They don't know their place. They become rivals, or all this great power politics, imperial talk. And I think that there's a much greater danger coming from that aspect of this governmental apparatus, the warfare state, than it does even the welfare state and the centrally planned economy.
The core issue goes back in discussing all these aspects, whether it be government regulation, the welfare state, foreign policy issues, is what is and should be the legitimate function of government in a free society. Are all of these activities, domestic and foreign, that the U.S. government is involved in and has been involved in for decades now, the basis of a free society? The answer has to be no. That we have to ask, are our liberties more secure or less secure? And that requires us to talk about another thing, which I have noticed, I've occasionally mentioned it in some of my articles, is that everyone talks about democracy, the importance of democracy, the cornerstones of democracy, the democratic institutional order, which is essential for a sound and stable and free society. The word that is either rarely heard or never heard in these debates, discourses, and discussions is the word liberty. That is what a free society is about, the autonomy of the individual, recognized as having certain rights that may not be touched by either private aggressors or majorities in the political arena. An area of his life that he is secure in, to go about his own goals in his own ways, in peaceful and voluntary association and interaction with others that are inviolable. His life, his liberty, his honestly acquired and peacefully used and non-fraudulently applied property on terms that he finds acceptable with his neighbors and associates and interchangers in the market arena. Unless you restore that notion of what liberty means and why it is important, which one of us wants to be a slave? I will sometimes ask my students when I teach a course on market ethics, which of you returned home after the day and were deeply frustrated and disappointed that no one had succeeded in killing you? Damn it, I'm still alive. How could this happen? Maybe better luck next time. Or when did you come home and at the end of the day you were frustrated that nobody had held you up and stolen your property or the money in your wallet? Gosh, I have been left unmolested today in my person and my property. I'm so despondent. Or how many of you ended your day feeling that you were very sad that no one had defrauded or cheated you or pulled a con over your eyes, right? That everyone you dealt with did so seemingly honestly and above board. Now, how would you feel if those things had been happened or been threatened? Your life had been threatened. Your person and your property had been attacked. Fraudulent dealing and wheeling had resulted in you being taken advantage of unjustly in the most commonsensical, everyday way. How would you feel about that? You'd be shocked. How dare someone attack me, both physically and in my person and property and in their dealings with me? Each one of us knows that these are the core senses of what it means to be a person possessing and respected in their rights to their life, their liberty, and their honestly acquired property. And anything else is an unjustifiable aggression, something immoral, unethical, reprehensible. And we normally respond when we see another person abused in that fashion. Are we not horrified when someone is just murdered? Are we not shocked when someone is just beaten up and robbed? Are we not indignant when someone has been cheated of that which they was honestly earned through some con job? That tells us that this is what each individual considers intuitively, even if they can't articulate some philosophical principle, intuitively, that each of us believes that we have a right to these things as human beings and not to be aggressed in them by either another private person or the government. That sense of that meaning of liberty needs to be restated and rearticulated and defended and explained why it is so important, both in our private dealings with our fellow citizens in everyday courses of life, and if the government does these things to us, whether it's a king who arbitrarily presumes to rule through his minions, or whether it be a majority who chooses to vote away my rights to my life, liberty, and property, or anyone else's. That is the core sense that we need to restore. Otherwise, this is a path that will continue down with extremely deleterious effects, as you were suggesting.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think your point about the utmost importance must be focused on the concept of liberty is right on. That that we have to define what liberty is. I mean, and we can start with the founding principles of economic liberty, the sound founding principles. No income tax. People keep everything they earn. They decide what to do with it. No Social Security, no Medicare. People sometimes say, "Oh, Jacob, you're advocating utopia." Really? Utopia is something that's not achievable. Our ancestors showed that this can be achievable because they achieved it. How can it be utopia if a society's achieved it? No welfare state, no warfare state. So there's your minimum foundation. And unfortunately, there's all too many libertarians that say, "Oh, that's just too hard. Oh, we got to just reform this thing. With Social Security, let's have a mandatory opt-out program where people are forced to invest in government stock markets and then provide for the next 30 years for people." Well, that's not freedom. Freedom is the absence of infringements on freedom. So if you say, "Well, I favor freedom, but I want to extend socialism for the next 30 years," well, if you're 30, okay, well then 30 years from now maybe you'll be free. But if you're 60, that shouldn't hold any interest for you unless you think you're going to live to be 90. And it's the same across the board with the welfare state. It's the same with the national security state. Our government started out as a limited government republic. That is consistent with a free society. A national security state is a totalitarian form of governmental structure. That's why they have the power now to assassinate and effect coups and support foreign dictatorships. So what we do at FFF is we raise people's vision. One, liberty's of the utmost important. Two, this is what you need to do to achieve a free society. It may be uncomfortable for people. It's not uncomfortable for me. But if you want freedom, if that's your priority, then you have to make the case for removing. If all you do is make the case for reforming this system, you haven't accomplished anything with respect to freedom. You may have improved the plight of the serfs on the plantation, just like reforming slavery might have improved the plight of the slaves. But the slaves would have known something important. It wasn't freedom. Reform of a slavery system is not freedom. Neither is reform of a serfdom system. So we have to keep making that case in the hopes that we persuade our fellow libertarians to join up with us. I mean, think if every libertarian in the country started advocating what a free society really was all about. Get rid of the voucher arguments and the privatization of Social Security arguments and the medical savings accounts and all this reform, or the NSA's spy system or whatever, and started advocating a real free society. Then I think we got a real shot, Richard, at reaching that critical mass that sweeps across society and bring us what we want, which is a genuine free society.
So, in other words, you want to get rid of the straitjacket of government control rather than just loosen up the laces.
That's a great way to put it. Or if you got a dog, I want to get rid of the leash. So I don't want to elongate the leash. I don't want to make the leash prettier and softer. I don't want the collar to be more comfortable. I want to remove it from the American people. So on that eloquent insightful note, we'll wrap things up. As always, greatly enjoyed the visit. And again, Happy New Year to everybody. Thanks for your great support. Thanks for your interest in our program. And we look forward to seeing you next week and every week afterward. Richard?
Thank you.